exactly as Major said, which is that the Supreme Court has said, look, federal courts have a role. They can be here when they're reviewing state courts and there are federal issues. And I think the big takeaway for everybody, exactly as Major said, is that the court does not adopt that independent state legislature theory that you and I spoke about back when the case was actually argued. And that would have essentially said that there's part of the Constitution called the Elections Clause. And it says that state legislatures set the time, place, and manner of elections. And under a broad reading of the state legislature theory, which again, I think was not adopted, we're clear, was not adopted by the court today, that would mean that when it comes to federal elections, state lawmakers essentially have unreviewable authority to do things like draw congressional maps, maybe move polling places, maybe change the language on ballots, to make a whole host of decisions about elections without having that check that we're used to. We're going to continue to have that check, meaning other players have a role here. Who are those other players? Secretaries of state, election administration officials, even state governors, state courts, and then also on top of all of that, the federal courts, if there is a federal issue.
And just I want people to have like sort of a little bit more clarification. You mentioned congressional maps, the drawing of congressional maps, right? Well, the way it works right now is, yes, state legislatures are responsible for that, but but they can be challenged. If there's a feeling that there is bias in the way the maps are drawn, then it goes to the court, and the court can say, go back and do it again. And so what this case was trying to do was eliminate that additional check, but that's not going to happen. Sorry, Vlad.
It's okay. David, to you. So what we've all been talking about is this independent state legislature theory, but it strikes me that the High Court suggests that there are limits as to what the states can do, but it leaves it kind of vague. If I'm not a lawyer, but that's the way I kind of read it. It's kind of vague as to what those limits might be.
I think that's right. We've all read this opinion in a very short amount of time, but I think that basically gets at the heart of this, that there might be cases where a state court exceeds its authority in reviewing a state legislative decision by virtue of the Elections Clause, perhaps, but this certainly wasn't it. And this was a case where, you're quite right, Emery, we've got a situation where a state legislature drew a map, and the state Supreme Court held that map violated the state's law, not federal law here, state's law. And the U.S. Supreme Court did something, although it's a momentous decision, it actually upholds nearly 250 years of the status quo, which is that the state court can do that. The state court has the authority under the state's constitution to review decisions of the state court. And it did that in this case, and it was appropriate to do that. And of course, the extension of that is this really radical independent state legislature theory that had never been adopted at any time in American history, that would have basically given legislatures free rein to do anything without any checks and balances, even by their own state Supreme Courts that were expressly charged with reviewing their enactments.
So, Major, I want to get back to you. This is actually the second case related to elections and voting that the Supreme Court has decided this session, and the other one also sort of leaned into the Voting Rights Act and bolstered it. Talk to us about the legal journey, the political landscape that led us to this point.
Right, so there was an assumption that this conservative Supreme Court would be indifferent or possibly hostile to underlying understandings and applications of the Voting Rights Act. I would say in that space, some people who held that opinion preemptively about the court have been surprised this term. Surprised in the sense that in a case in Alabama, this Supreme Court said, you know, this drawn map for congressional districts in Alabama clearly violates the Voting Rights Act and must be redrawn to create another majority-minority district. Yesterday, it held in a separate ruling that an underlying lower court decision in Louisiana had to be enforced. What was that underlying decision? That similarly, the lines in Louisiana have been drawn in a way to minimize support and ability of majority-minority districts to function in that state. And those lines had to be redrawn to add another district. So in Alabama and Louisiana, this court has said, if the lines are egregious and it is so clear the intent is to minimize the voting power of minority voters, this court will intervene, and will intervene on the side of the Voting Rights Act. For those who were wondering exactly what this court's attitude would be about the Voting Rights Act and its real-world application, these two cases suggest the court, when presented with a set of facts that it regards as unassailable and egregious drawing of lines that are clearly meant to create partisan advantage and minimize the voting power of minority voters, it will intervene. It did so in Alabama, and it did so indirectly in Louisiana. And with this case in North Carolina, it basically said all of our understandings about state legislative power are true. They are monitored by the state Supreme Court, and the federal courts can intervene, again, if there is something egregious. But all of our common understandings about state legislative power remain where they are. They are not enlarged by any stretch of the imagination as petitioners sought.
And Jessica, this is coming after the Supreme Court had, issued rulings that many said weakened the Voting Rights Act.
Absolutely. And I agree with everything Major said. I will say that the Alabama case, while I was surprised, if we actually look at it, I think what's really happening is Chief Justice John Roberts saying this case is not the good case to take to further weaken the Voting Rights Act. If there's one thing that John Roberts does not like, I think it's bad lawyering. And there was not great lawyering in that case. That was not a good vehicle to further whittle away the Voting Rights Act. And as Justice Kagan said, when it came to that Alabama decision, that case was a, quote, easy call because it was fairly egregious that, in fact, the lines were drawn to dilute minority voting power. And as Major said, what the court said yesterday in the Louisiana case is basically go back and go ahead and draw another majority minority district, just as we said you need to in Alabama. So on the one hand, yes, absolutely, the court has kind of stopped its steady march towards weakening the protections of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 being that provision dealing with vote dilution, diluting people's voting power on the basis of race. Having said that, I think if next term or the term after that, there's a better case that comes up that allows the conservative majority to whittle away at the voting rights power and protection, I think we could see that steady march continue. I think it's just these weren't the cases in the end where the court wanted to do that.
All right, Jessica, last question before we let you all go. What are the other big cases we're still waiting for?
We're waiting on affirmative action. We're waiting on President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. We're waiting on a big case dealing with the power of state anti-discrimination laws and how those laws kind of match up in a battle with religious objectors. And I think for people watching at home, those are probably the big three that they're still looking for.
All right, Jessica Levinson, David Becker, Major Garrett, always great to have you. I know, Major, you're standing by at the Supreme Court to await more decisions. We appreciate it. I hope it doesn't rain. We'll talk to you all in a bit, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Vladimir Putin addressed his country for the first time after a short-lived rebellion. We'll talk to a former official from the National Security Council about that. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.
An original documentary from CBS reports. Controversial Congressman George Santos.
Why won't you answer our questions?
How did he manage to get elected?
Thank you very much, and God bless you, and God bless the USA.
George Santos' campaign was a campaign of deceit, lies, and fabrication.
And who is he, really?
I knew him